Have you ever suddenly realized that you've become a nuisance to someone who claimed to love you? Have you ever looked into a child's eyes and realized that the love there is gone? I felt it the day they left me at a gas station and never came back. It was supposed to be just a quick trip to the pharmacy. That's what my daughter said. Mom, we'll be right back. We're just going to get some medicine real quick. I didn't even suspect anything. Who would suspect someone who carried them in their arms, nursed them through a fever, fed them with whatever they had, and still smiled even though they had no strength? I sat there, on a hard plastic bench, holding my little fabric bag, the kind we sew ourselves with care, and watched the minutes turn into hours. No calls, no messages, no signal. Little by little, I began to understand. It wasn't a delay, it was abandonment. Have you ever been there? Have you ever realized that someone who claimed to love you was actually discarding you? At 76, with swollen feet and an aching heart, I understood. My presence was bothersome. My existence was uncomfortable. The mother who had once been everything had become nothing more than a reminder that time passes and that caring is hard work. And you know what hurt the most? It wasn't the cold gas station, nor the silence. It was the look on the cashier's face, a mix of pity and confusion, as if asking with her eyes, "Why did they leave you here? Stay with me until the end, because this story isn't just about me. It's about many of us, women who gave everything for their families, and one day find themselves forgotten, invisible, discarded as if they were nothing. It's about sacrifices that no one remembers, sleepless nights that no one is grateful for, and a type of pain that only those who have been through it know. This is one of those true stories that touches the heart, that exposes the ingratitude of children and grandchildren who have lost all sense of respect and honor. It is also a story of return, of silent strength, of the wisdom of old age, the wisdom that life teaches when the world turns its back. There, between the cars passing by and the smell of gasoline, I made a choice, because the truth is that they thought I would cry, that I would beg, that I would accept in silence, but they didn't know one thing. Inside me, there was still a strength no one saw, a flame lit by everything I'd experienced, by everything I'd endured in silence. And it was in that moment, at that gas station where they left me, as if I were disposable, that something inside me awakened. If anything in this story has upset you, leave a comment below to tell me what bothered you most, because, as hard as this pain is, it's not just mine. There are many people who will recognize themselves in this silence, in this abandonment that hurts more than words. And when you comment, you don't just share your story, you help others feel less alone. This story touched your heart in any way, click like. It may seem like a small gesture, but it shows YouTube that this kind of truth needs to reach more people. And if you feel this kind of content needs to continue, real stories of people who were forgotten but didn't keep quiet, subscribe to the channel, because each new subscription is like a hug for those who tell these stories from the heart. And in that moment, between humiliation and silence, I made a decision. I was always told that being a mother was synonymous with sacrifice, and I believed it my whole life. I woke up before everyone else, made coffee, packed backpacks, ran with bills in my hands and hope in my chest. There were days when I forgot to eat, but others never went without what they needed. I was my grandchildren's nanny even before I became a grandmother. I was their counselor in times of crisis, and a cook even on days when my hands trembled with exhaustion. All of this out of love, not obligation. I never asked for anything in return. No favors, no recognition. I just wanted my presence to be remembered with affection, not with burden. But time passes, and with it goes what many pretend they still have, gratitude. They grew up, made their lives, their choices, their paths, and little by little, I realized my space was shrinking. Not because the house got smaller, but because my usefulness, in their eyes, seemed to have an expiration date. As if a mother's love had an expiration date. And it's strange to say this, but it's a silent pain. It doesn't come with fighting. It doesn't come with shouting. It comes with absence, with empty stares, with long silences during dinner. Little by little, I began to notice that I was only called upon when they needed something, when the bills were tight, when the babysitter was absent, when someone was sick. I became the solution. And when everything fell into place, the silence returned. It was as if I existed only in the background of their lives, a functional but invisible figure. And we start to accept it. We start to convince ourselves that this is it, that being a mother means being annulled, that growing old means being silent. Until one day, something breaks inside. And it's not anger, it's lucidity. My house was being replaced by cramped hallways. My lunches were cold food left in the fridge. And yet, I smiled. I smiled in photos. I smiled at my grandchildren. I smiled on special occasions as if I didn't want to bother anyone. Because we learn that complaining, at this age, is being grumpy. And no one wants to hear it. No one wants to hear the truth hidden behind the makeup we no longer wear. The strangest thing is that, even with all this, my heart continued to believing that, at some point, they would notice. That they would see the effort, the love, the constant presence. That they would miss me. That they would invite me to dinner without asking for anything in return. But reality showed me otherwise. It showed me that I had become a secondary character in their lives. A living reminder of what they no longer wanted to see. Their origins. No many people will relate to this. Not because you're living in exactly the same scenario, but because you feel the same impact. That feeling of having given everything time, energy, youth, and still finding yourself alone when you needed comfort the most. And it's in this loneliness, which isn't of walls, but of the soul, that we begin to see things differently. We begin to question the so-called family. I began to notice the details, the tones of voice, the invitations that never came, the unfulfilled promises. And all of this accumulated like pieces of a puzzle that, one day, I would be forced to put together alone. Transformation, for me, didn't come with a scream. It came with a silence, one of those that echoes within, and that's where the real decision lies, to continue accepting or to start living differently. There in that clinic, I remembered every little moment I'd said yes to them and no to myself. Every time I'd stopped going out to care, every opportunity I'd turned down for fear of displeasing them. And I realized that what was hurting me so much now wasn't actually new. It was just a reflection of everything I'd been ignoring out of love. Maybe you're reading this and feeling your heart ache, and that's okay. Sometimes, what we need most is to get it out. So tell me, what word best describes how you feel when you hear all this? Write it in the comments, just one word. I want to know if you also carry this story inside. Karen invited me to go for a walk, as she did from time to time. She said she had some free time and wanted to spend it with me. Just the two of us, like old times. I dressed with the same care as someone about to meet the world outside. I chose a floral blouse, put on the necklace she gave me years ago for Mother's Day, and waited at the gate with a light heart. In my mind, it was a gift, a gesture of affection. A rare but precious moment. I still felt there was room for us. We got in the car, and she was smiling, as if everything was normal. She asked if I was feeling okay, if I wanted anything to drink, and said she was going to stop quickly to get some medicine for Rick, her husband. It'll only take 5 minutes, Mom, of course. I said okay. She parked at a gas station on the side of the road. She said it was right there, at the pharmacy next door. She asked me to wait in the car. But after a few seconds, she asked me to get out so she could maneuver better, and I did. She got back in the car, smiled, and drove off. She sped off, without looking back, without saying anything else, and I stayed. At first I thought it was a joke, that she was just circling the block, that something had happened, that it was a misunderstanding. I sat on a nearby bench and waited. 10 minutes, then 20, then an hour. The sun began to set, and with it, the penny dropped. I felt my chest tighten in a way I can't describe. It wasn't just pain, it was disbelief. A kind of silence that screams from within, that feeling of being deceived, discarded, left behind as if worthless. I tried to understand. I created hypotheses. Maybe something had happened. Maybe someone had gotten sick. Maybe she'd come back. But the truth was before me, stark and raw. She'd left me there, like someone abandoning an old object. And it was in that moment that a part of me that still believed died. What hurt me wasn't the abandonment itself. It was the coldness, the calculation, the lie. Because to leave me there, she had to plan, she had to act with intention. And that reveals much more than words. My head began to spin with memories. I found myself remembering the birthdays I'd organized for her, the difficult times when I'd slept on the hospital floor just to be near, the times I'd sold lunch to pay for her prep school. And there, Amid the smell of gasoline and the dust of the road, these memories came like little stabs, not because they were bad, but because they showed the contrast between everything I'd given and what I'd received in return. The hidden truth behind all this wasn't about her leaving me there. It was about what she'd been doing for years. Slowly erasing me, turning me into someone convenient, useful, but invisible. That post was just the final stop on a journey already being written behind the scenes. The physical abandonment only reflected the emotional abandonment I'd long felt. And as I waited, I realized there was no point in crying anymore. The tears dried before they could even fall. It was as if my body knew there was no point in begging for explanations anymore. It was there, on that hard bench, that my mindset shifted, that I began to see myself differently. Not as a victim, but as someone who, for the first time, needed to make a different decision. Everything around me continued as if nothing had happened. Cars came and went. People were filling up, talking, living, and there I was, standing there, being pushed into a truth no one wants to face. Sometimes, the ones who hurt the most are the ones you've protected the most. If you've come this far, and any part of this story touched you in a special way, write the word in the comments. Wake up. I want to know who also started to see something different after being silent for so long. I don't know how long I sat there. The world seemed to spin at a different pace. My thoughts came and went like waves crashing silently. Some memories hurt so much they felt like they were pounding against my chest with physical force. But somewhere in the midst of it all, something inside me shifted. It wasn't sudden, nor was it anger. It was a silent, almost imperceptible, but profound turn. A decision born not of resentment, but of understanding. They had discarded me, labeled me a burden, and in that moment, I understood that waiting for justice from them was like trying to hold the wind in my hands. It was futile. The pain of abandonment is intense, but the pain of continually diminishing yourself is even greater. It was at the moment that I began to ask myself, what was I doing with my story? With everything I'd lived, everything I'd built. I had become hostage to a role that no longer belonged to me. The role of the available mother, the woman who always gave in, the figure who only exists when she's useful to others. It was time to free myself from that image, to take, for the first time, responsibility for what would come from here on out. And that was the quietest yet most powerful transformation I've ever experienced. It wasn't about revenge, it was about dignity, about reclaiming the piece of myself that had been forgotten amidst the diaper changes, the rushed dinners, the sleepless nights. Because there, alone in that post, I realized there was still a woman inside me, a whole woman, who had cried too much for someone who saw nothing but her own desires. And it was this woman who got up from that bench. I took off my shoes, my feet hurt. I walked into the convenience store, my heart racing. I asked for a glass of water. The attendant looked at me strangely, and I took a deep breath. I wasn't going to explain anything. I didn't owe anyone an explanation. And perhaps that was my first act of true independence in years. A small decision, but one that had a huge impact on me. I exist, and I don't need anyone's acceptance to justify it. People talk a lot about starting over, but what no one says is that a true new beginning begins within, before any external action. It begins when we change the way we see ourselves. And that day, I began to see myself again, not as the forgotten mother, nor as the erased grandmother, but as someone who could still write her own chapters, even if the previous ones were marked by pain. I was afraid, of course, afraid of not knowing where to go, of having nowhere to return, afraid of not being capable. But the fear didn't last as long as the shame I'd been carrying for years. Shame of bothering others, shame of growing old, shame of no longer being necessary. And when that shame began to fade, it became easier to see the truth. It wasn't me who needed to be different. It was their perspective that was distorted. I decided then that from then on, every step I took would be for myself, longer for them, no longer to please or be accepted. I realized that I had never allowed myself to exist beyond the role of caregiver, and perhaps that's why it hurt so much when they left me, because I didn't even know who I was without them. But in that moment, a new identity began to emerge within me, one that didn't depend on applause or invitations to Sunday lunch. I went to the side of the road and asked for help, without shame, without fear. A truck driver stopped. She looked me in the eye as if she saw my whole story there. and without many questions, she offered me a seat in the truck. The journey that began there wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual, quietly liberating. For the first time, I wasn't running away. I was coming home to myself. If you understood what I felt on that bench, if it made sense in any way, write the sentence here in the comments. That's where I woke up. I want to know if anyone else has ever gone through this kind of internal shift. The truck driver dropped me off a few hours later in a small town, the kind where time seems to slow down. It was early evening, and the cold was beginning to bite into my bones. I didn't know where I was or where to begin. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel panic. I felt a strange peace, because I had nothing left to lose. The worst had already happened. The rest would be, at best, a surprise. I walked the streets as if searching for a place within myself, until I saw a light on in a small corner cafe. The smell of fresh bread drew me inside effortlessly. It was a simple, cozy place with a homey feel. And it was there that I met Donna Ruth, a lady with neatly combed white hair, a flowered apron, and eyes that had seen more than any book could tell. She didn't ask me many questions. She offered me a hot coffee and left me in silence, as if she knew that was exactly what I needed. The next day, I returned to the cafe. I asked if she could help with something, anything. She hesitated at first, but then smiled as if recognizing courage in disguise. You can start by washing the cups. And that's how it all began. Washing dishes, silently, with dignity, and with a determination I myself hadn't known. Each day, I arrived a little earlier. I learned how to use the coffee maker, then how to arrange the cakes in the display case. One day, without anyone asking, I brought some homemade sweets I made for family birthdays. Donna Ruth tasted them, looked at me with that sharp gaze of someone who senses opportunity, and placed the sweets on the counter. They began to come out, one after the other. People asked if I made them to order. And there, amid the smell of sugar and yeast, a door opened. I set up a small wooden table in the corner of the cafe, an embroidered tablecloth, a little sign, with my name, Maggie's Recipes. No one knew my story. No one imagined I'd been left behind, as if I'd been rid of a problem. They only saw the smiling lady who made the best cupcakes in town, and I let it be. Because in that new beginning, I no longer wanted to live from the pain. I wanted to live from what I chose to build. Inside, of course, there were scars. Some took a long time to heal. But what sustained me now was no longer the hope of being recognized by those who left me. It was the certainty that I was finally in control of my own journey. Every dish washed, every sweet sold, every customer who smiled upon tasting my recipe, all of this was a reminder that I was still alive, and more, that I could still make a difference, even if it was in a small way. Silently, the mindset with which I began to look at life changed completely. I no longer wanted to go back to the way I was. That version of me was tired, exhausted from so much compromise. I wanted to be new, a new Maggie, with gray hair and aching knees, yes, but with my soul awake, with my eyes open, with a plan. And that plan no longer involved asking for space at tables where I wasn't wanted. It involved creating my own table, even if it was small, even if it had wooden benches, but where I was welcome, where I was seen. And it was there, between baking and quick chats with customers, that I began to rebuild myself, without fanfare, without needing to prove anything to anyone. It was my own process, a reconstruction that was happening behind the scenes in my silence. The biggest revelation wasn't discovering I was capable. It was realizing I always had been. I'd just been sleeping, waiting for someone to give me permission. And now, I was giving that permission myself. If at any point in your life you also felt the need to create your own table, write here in the comments. I built my space. I want to know who else has experienced this kind of turnaround, without an audience, but with a lot of meaning. As I washed the pans in the late afternoon, the scent of caramelized sugar still wafting through the air, my mind returned unbidden. Some memories have a way of appearing when we're too quiet. And there, between one dish and another, came the days when I sold lunchboxes in the neighborhood to pay for Karen's prep course. I vividly remember the stove being on since early morning, the fluffy rice I cooked just right without looking, and the notes stuck on the fridge so I wouldn't forget who had asked for it without onions, who preferred chicken instead of beef. Walked from door to door, carefully holding my bags, always smiling, even when my knee ached and the heat ran down my forehead. And the strangest thing is, I never felt less because of it. On the contrary, it gave me purpose. It made me believe that, somehow, I was building my daughter's future with my own hands. There was no sacrifice, there was love. And that kind of love doesn't demand recognition, but it also doesn't deserve contempt. There was that time my grandson Jake was hospitalized for days. Karen and Rick were swamped with work, saying they couldn't miss work. So I went. I slept 2 nights, sitting on those iron hospital chairs, holding his little hand, making up stories so he wouldn't cry from his medication. I remember changing diapers with my back stiff, making chamomile tea at 3 in the morning because he said he could only sleep with grandma's scent around, and that's where the lump in my throat lives. It wasn't the abandonment itself that destroyed me. It was realizing that all those memories, which for me were still vivid, full of color, smell, and sound, seemed to them to have evaporated, as if they'd never happened, as if they were just the banal duties of a grandmother who had nothing better to do. And perhaps that's the cruelest part of memory. It doesn't weigh on those who should remember it. I remember sleeping on the couch for months, just so I wouldn't get in the way of Karen and her husband's room. I said it was temporary, but I knew it had become permanent. And yet, every day I folded the blanket neatly, adjusted the pillow, and made her breakfast with toast, just the way she liked it. It's hard to admit it now, but there were days when I'd settle for just a long good morning, as if that alone were proof I was still seen. I gave everything. My Sundays, my holidays, my birthdays. When someone was sick, I was the first to arrive. When money was tight, I devised ways to help without them noticing. I did this to avoid hurting their perhaps, deep down, to protect the little dignity I still had left in the relationship. I didn't want to be a burden. I wanted to be a foundation, support, a reference. But the hidden truth was something else. I was sacrificing myself in the name of a love that no longer recognized me. And then, in this contrast between what was and what is, I began to understand that there is no transformation without an honest confrontation with old pains, the ones we keep pushing under the rug, saying they're nothing, that they'll pass, but they don't. What's left unaddressed comes back. What's left unsaid screams inside. And it was there, in that little cafe, that I began to put the pieces in order. Not out of anger, but out of a need to heal, to rebuild my own narrative. People saw me as the sweet little cupcake lady, but inside, I carried chapters no one read. And perhaps that's why each batch I made wasn't just a sweet treat. It was an act of resistance. It was my way of moving forward, without erasing the past, but also without allowing it to define me. Because the biggest turning point in my life wasn't the moment I was abandoned. It was the moment I chose what to do with everything that still hurt me. If, at any point in your life you felt that your memories were not valued as they should be, write the following sentence in the comments. I haven't forgotten what I did. For them, I want to read every voice that has also been silenced by a story that deserved respect. It's curious how, after all this, what weighs most heavily isn't the absence of others, but the absence of recognition. Not recognition as praise, but as presence, as a genuine gaze. Because we endure loneliness, sacrifice, even pain. But what truly empties us is realizing that everything you did and did with love has been forgotten, as if it never existed. And if you've come this far feeling something similar, if a memory of yours has surfaced, or if a part of your heart has ached, write it down in the comments. It doesn't have to be an entire story. It can be a snippet, a feeling, a thought that's been echoing, because when you share, other people recognize themselves too. And sometimes, just knowing we're not alone on this journey eases the weight we carry. If this story touched you in any way, reminded you of someone, or simply touched you deeply, please leave a like. It's just a click, but it has a real impact. It shows that these voices need to be heard, that these stories matter, that there's value in every word spoken from the heart. And if you want to continue following this kind of content of life, of overcoming, of hidden truths that almost no one has the courage to tell, subscribe to the channel here. It's this gesture that allows these messages to reach more people, that strengthens this community of those who feel, remember, fight, and choose to move on even after so much pain. And in the midst of it all, in that small corner cafe, I understood that there was still something inside me that no one had been able to erase. My ability to start over. The days passed, and with them, fear gave way to clarity. The work routine, the new faces, the simple conversations at the counter, all of it reconnected me with parts of myself that had been dormant. I wasn't just the woman left at a gas station. I was a whole woman, with a story, with strength, with a new direction in her hands. The strangest thing about life is that when we stop chasing acceptance, it starts to come from where we least expect it. I became known in the city. People came for the sweets, but returned for the conversations. And somehow, there, between recipes and respected silences, I began to heal. Little by little, I let go of the need to understand the why of it all. Some pains, I discovered, aren't meant to be explained, they're meant to be transcended. But life has a sense of justice that we don't immediately grasp. It takes time, but it comes. It was on a Sunday morning that I heard it. Donna Ruth arrived with the newspaper tucked under her arm, as she did every weekend, and while we were having coffee, she said, "Did you see this?" It was a headline: "Woman involved in family fraud, scheme loses assets and faces charges of embezzlement." The photo was clear. Karen, my daughter. At that moment, time stood still. Not out of anger, nor revenge, but out of a kind of silent shock. Life was showing me that everything returns, that the hidden truth always finds a way to surface, even if by chance. And the most impactful thing is that, when I saw her face there, printed on the paper, I didn't taste victory. I felt emptiness. Like someone looking at a house that was once a home, but now has only walls and an echo. Days later, she showed up. She knocked on the cafe door, as if she knew exactly where to find me. She was dejected, different, but with the same urgent tone as always. She didn't hug me, she didn't cry. She was direct. "Mom, I need help. They told me that you have money now." And in that moment, I knew it wasn't regret. It was desperation. It wasn't love. It was need. The same need she said she had the day she left me at that gas station. She began to explain debts, betrayals, bankruptcy, a mixture of mistakes and hurts that weren't mine. And as she spoke, I watched her silently. Her every word was a reminder of who I had become, who I would never be again. When she finished, there was a moment of waiting. She looked at me, waiting for me to say yes, as I always did. But I took a deep breath, looked her in the eye, and said, "Now, I'm the one who decides." And it wasn't revenge. It was clarity. It was a decision based not on hurt, but on conscience. I could help, but at what cost? At what price? Because sometimes, the deepest act of love is setting boundaries. And that day, I chose for myself. I chose not to hurt myself anymore, trying to repair the wreckage of those who turned their backs on me. There was no scream. There was no drama. She just lowered her eyes, murmured something like, "I understand," and walked away. And I stood there, watching the door close, my heart light. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't bleeding inside. I was standing firm, rooted in everything I'd experienced, in everything I'd overcome. In that moment, I understood that divine justice isn't punishment, it's balance. It's when life gives back to each person what was planted, without us having to get dirty for it. If you have ever experienced or witnessed a situation in which life itself brought a return that no one expected, write the following phrase in the comments: "Life took its toll on itself." I want to know who else has seen this turnaround happen, not through revenge, but through the power of truth. She left with her shoulders hunched, but not from regret, from weariness. A weariness that wasn't mine. It was the weight of her own choices, of those decisions made in the dark, thinking they would never come to fruition. And that was how I watched my daughter walk out the same door she'd made me walk through years ago, without looking back. The difference was that this time, I was in control. And that was, perhaps, the most profound revelation of this entire journey. For a long time, I believed I needed justice in the literal sense. I wanted her to acknowledge what she did, to ask for forgiveness, to cry over the memories that still burned inside me. But life has a subtle way of teaching. Sometimes, the greatest form of justice is showing that we managed to move on, even after everything, that what they tried to destroy became strength, that the name they tried to erase is now remembered by others, with respect, with affection, with gratitude. That afternoon, after she left, I sat in the same chair where I usually write my recipes. I looked out the cafe window, saw the hustle and bustle of the street, the customers arriving, and I realized life had begun again for me, not in shouting, not in confrontation, but in the silence of my decisions. I no longer needed to prove anything. What I had built spoke for me. The most powerful thing is understanding that dignity isn't about what others do to you, but about how you choose to react. I could have reached out, offered help, and repeated the cycle, but I chose differently. I chose to preserve my peace. And that wasn't easy. My maternal instinct still lives within me. But the woman I've become has learned that not every gesture of help is healthy. Sometimes, the most loving thing we can do is keep our distance from those who didn't know how to value our presence. It was at this point in my journey that I realized the true impact of my choices. Before, I was guided by guilt, by fear of being misunderstood, by that old mentality that mother is forever, no matter what. But now, I understand that love also has limits, that respect is the bare minimum, and that blood ties don't matter if the emotional bond was broken by selfishness and neglect. This turning point didn't happen overnight. It was a process, an accumulation of small revelations, of old pains being revisited, of hidden truths coming to light. And amidst this tangle of emotions, something emerged that I had never felt so fully. Freedom. Freedom to be who I am, without fear. Freedom to say no, without guilt. Freedom to live a new phase, without carrying the burden of pleasing those who didn't mind hurting me. Today, when people ask me what happened to my family, I don't lie, but I don't explain myself either. I simply say that life has taught me who stays, who leaves, and who should never have returned, and I let time do the rest. Because the truth, when it arrives, needs no defense. It stands on its own, and when I look at all of this, at this journey that began with abandonment and ended in reconstruction, I understand that not all pain is a sentence. Some are just the starting point for something bigger. Something we don't yet see when everything falls apart, but that takes shape when we choose not to give in. And this choice, however difficult it may be, is always in our hands. If you've ever had a moment where you realized that standing your ground was more important than being understood, write the following phrase in the comments: I chose my peace. Because sometimes, the true act of love is simply not letting yourself be destroyed by what we once called home. Even with all the peace I've found on this new path, there are days when the silence weighs differently, not the silence of abandonment, but a deeper silence, one that carries the absence of what could have been. There are nights when the image of Jake, my grandson, appears like a breath, the sound of his laughter as he ran through the house, his narrowed eyes calling me grandma, the smell of his head after a bathful of it returns without asking permission, and returns with a vengeance. I know he wasn't to blame for anything, that he was too young to understand his mother's decisions. But I also know that after that day, I never saw him again. And that's where the price of freedom lies. It comes with sacrifices we don't choose wholeheartedly, but accept with a weary soul. Because to have peace, I had to give up ties that only existed on one side, and that still hurts. It's easy to romanticize a fresh start, to say it's just a matter of turning the page and moving on. But no one talks about the emptiness that remains when we choose what's right for us, Yvonne, if it means losing the ones we loved most. The hidden truth of emotional maturity is this: we can't carry everyone with us. Some need to be left behind, even if it erases a piece of our history. I look back at my new life with gratitude, but I can't deny that sometimes I feel homesick. I miss a hug that might never come again, a drawing made with crayons, a shouted "I love you, Grandma" from across the room, and I cry, silently, without drama, like someone who understands that certain scars don't heal, they just settle into the body, and that's okay. I've learned to respect this part of the journey, too, because there's a huge difference between being at peace and being immune to pain. I'm at peace with my choices, with my journey, with the woman I've become. But that doesn't mean I don't miss it, that I don't question myself at times, that I don't find myself wondering what would have been like if things had gone differently. Maturity doesn't erase feelings, it only teaches us to embrace what remains. And in this new phase, I learned to live with more presence, to value the present, to listen more, judge less, to understand that not every story ends happily, but that doesn't mean we can't find beauty along the way. Life isn't just about encounters, it's also about goodbyes that set us free. And each of these goodbyes, however painful, is filled with wisdom. Today, when someone asks me if I have children, I take a deep breath, not out of shame, nor out of resentment, but because I know the answer carries much more than words. It carries a story, and stories don't always need to be explained. Sometimes, they just need to be felt. I don't know if Jake will ever look for me. I don't know if he'll remember me, if he'll ask why I disappeared. But if that happens, I want to be ready. Not to judge, not to demand, but to look him in the eyes and tell him that, even from afar, I never stopped loving him. Because true love doesn't depend on physical presence. It survives in silent care, in the desire for good, in the memory that refuses to fade. And that's why, even after losing my daughter, I don't feel empty. Because I found within myself a whole woman who learned to move forward with dignity, even while carrying longing. A woman who traded fear for awareness, guilt for autonomy, and who today lives with her feet in the present and her heart at peace. If at some point in your life you also needed to let go of someone to be able to continue breathing in peace, write the phrase here in the comments, I chose to stay whole. Because we can only move forward when we understand that sometimes loving also means knowing how to let go. If there's one thing life has taught me through everything I've experienced, it's that time waits for no one. It passes quickly, as if it were committed to oblivion, and before we know it, the opportunities that seemed eternal have already become memories. I learned this the hard way, not through the absence of others, but through the absence they themselves created within me. It's strange to think that someone can be alive, but have already said their emotional goodbyes long ago. And as much as I've rebuilt my life and grown stronger with each choice, there's one thing that never changes: the value of origin. Those simple moments of care, of presence, of silence, divided into peace, they are the invisible pillars of our history. And when someone disregards this, when they turn their back on those who held their roof over their heads with love and effort, they lose more than they can imagine. They lose direction. They lose meaning. They lose their roots. There are people who spend their lives trying to grow, conquer, and climb, and forget to look back. They forget that it was in their mother's lap that they learned to walk. They forget that it was in their grandmother's cooking that they found comfort when everything seemed confusing. And one day, when the penny drops, when life takes its toll on what was neglected, it's often too late. The chair is empty. The embrace that was once a given is now a memory. I know every family has its conflicts. I know there are pains that can't be healed with a phone call. But I also know there are silences that only need a gesture to be broken. Sometimes, all that's needed is a connection, an unexpected visit, a non-judgmental listening ear, something simple, but with an impact that no one can measure because it touches where the soul still beats. And if you have a mother, a grandmother, a woman who was the foundation of your story and who is still there, alive, waiting without saying anything, call her today, not because it's an obligation, but because there's still time, because there's still a road between you, and because the regret of not having tried weighs much more heavily than any momentary pride. Life is too fragile to let love wait in the priority queue. My story isn't just about pain, it's about transformation, about a journey back to myself, about discovering that even after losing so much, it's still possible to rebuild with dignity. But it's also a wake-up call, a revelation, a reminder that abandonment has consequences that transcend time. It wounds the essence of who we are, where we came from, what we will leave behind. I leave this story here not to point fingers, but to hold up a mirror, so that each of us can look within and ask ourselves, have I valued those who taught me to love? Because, in the end, titles disappear, money vanishes, success moves, but true affection remains, or should. And if this story awakened any memories in you, if it reminded you of someone who deserves to be remembered while still alive, write the phrase here in the comments, I don't want to be too late. Because sometimes, what saves an entire story is just one gesture. A single gesture, made while there's still time. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. Sometimes, all we need is someone who listens slowly, who understands without judgment. And if this story resonated with you, if it touched a chord deep inside you, leave a like. It's a simple way of saying, I was there, I felt it too. Take advantage and subscribe to the channel to continue following these stories that, despite being unique, carry pieces of us. Here, we talk about life as it is, with pain, with new beginnings, with truth. And if you want to show me that you were with me until the end, write here in the comments. This message was for me. I would love to know who walked with me until the last minute. There's a video here that complements this topic. Click and continue with me there. The conversation isn't over yet.